Why does the New Testament contain some books, but not others? There have been a variety of answers to this question, not all of them particularly good.
The Council of Nicaea took all the books they had and threw them on a table. The ones that fell off the table didn't make it into the Canon.
The Canon was decided by a bunch of evil Paul-loving jerks inspired by Satan. Satan! Satan!
The Canon! Oh yes, it was decided by the mystic forces of the Shambhala, very much so.
Well, none of these is correct, of course, and in this series we'll have a look at the real history of the New Testament Canon. But first we need to lay some groundwork. Christianity didn't invent the idea of a canon, or a normative collection of sacred books. The Church had the Jewish Old Testament as a model, and even well before the Old Testament was firmly decided, a normative collection of sacred books was a concept known from Egyptian and Mesopotamian society. But why would a group want or need a canon? It may be helpful to draw an analogy to a secular canon, namely the founding and legal documents that form the canon of the United States of America. What might be included in an American canon? Certainly documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights with all its amendments, and so also perhaps the codified laws of our nation and the records of our judiciary and executive branches. Also arguably, our American canon would contain exemplary histories of the nation, which give personal examples of how the American ideal is to be expressed. But how would we decide what would enter into the canon of America? Let's illustrate the answer with a series of concentric circles. The first and most obvious delineation would be that we'd want things in the canon that related truth about the history and nature of America. So obviously, an American canon would not include laws that are not laws of our nation. It would also not be desirable to include false or apocryphal material if it is presented as though it were true. The classic yet apocryphal tale of Washington hewing down a cherry tree would be excluded if it were reported as history. But perhaps if it were presented as an edifying fiction, it could enter the canon on that basis. Truth is an obvious criterion for a canon, but a fact like 2 + 2 = 4, while obviously true, would have no place in an American canon. So we have to draw another smaller circle. That second circle would be a criterion of relevance. Our American canon is a canon for America. It would obviously make no sense to include documents from the French Revolution or a history of Japan. Now here we might have some discussion or dispute for the first time when it comes to defining the criteria. Some might wish to argue that the English Magna Carta of 1215, which was reportedly an inspiration for the authors of the Declaration of Independence, ought to be in the American canon, even though it is a native English document. Some might also argue that other works that inspired the American founders, such as The Spirit of Laws by Montesquieu, ought to be included, or perhaps an explicative work like the Federalist Papers. Others may say that such documents belong at best in a Deuterocanon, not on the order of something like the Declaration of Independence, but in a separate, less prominent and authoritative collection. Relevance is an obvious necessity for defining a canon, but it can also be slippery and difficult to define. To that extent, critics often overplay discussions and differences between canonical lists in various parts of Christendom. The problem is not with Christendom itself, but the problem in the main is that relevance is a difficult criterion to define and apply. Certain things are easy to exclude, but others are not. But we'll get to that more when we discuss specific examples. Finally, an even smaller circle is needed, one with a more objective approach. what is in a canon must have been produced by an authoritative witness. Clearly, in every field, whether medicine or electrical engineering or history, there are some whose views hold more weight than others. And there are always objective ways to separate the wheat from the chaff, such as who holds credentials in the field, and how close are they to the subject matter. Our American canon would have works in it by America's founders, such as Jefferson and Washington, and perhaps works by high government officials. For the New Testament church, there was an obvious way to draw an objective line in the sand in terms of authority. Canonicity must be limited to documents authored by those who are either eyewitnesses to the ministry and life of Jesus, such as Peter and Matthew, or to those who worked under the authority of such eyewitnesses, such as Mark, or to those specially called by Jesus, like Paul and James, and those who worked under them, such as Luke. That this criterion is able to be successfully implemented and works well as a defining factor is shown in that even heretical groups agreed to it, appending the names of such people as Thomas and Mary to their own works. Beyond this, there would be little reason for anyone to object to the content of our American canon. While some persons may feel slighted by the exclusion of some personally favored document, even based on objective criteria, they will need far more than personal preference to force the issue. A canon is a collection that is in many ways a convenience, a way to offer adherents a collection of the most important and relevant truths they will need in order to serve the larger body of persons of which they are a part. Our American canon would include whatever a person needs to function as a loyal and useful American citizen. Anything that serves only narrow and local interests probably doesn't deserve a place. As we proceed, we'll see that the process of composing the New Testament canon did indeed operate under these criteria, or forms thereof. While it is of course impossible to please everyone, especially every postmodern individualist one, it will become clear that it is the burden of the critic and dissenter to make a case for inclusion or exclusion of any book of the New Testament. Now we turn to what factors influenced the development of that canon. To begin, here in Part 2 we'll lay out some summary statements of fact and argument. Our primary argument has to do with the chosen 27 books of the Canon. These books were chosen by the collective will of the church at large, and formalized as a canon by persons in authority who represented that church. We'll discuss the details of that later on, but for now we need to ask the question, what if someone within the church at large disagrees with this selection? What if, say, they think a few don't belong there, for whatever reason?
You know, I really can't stand the book of James. It uses the word "the" too much.
Or what if they think the collection could stand to add something?
Hey, you know what needs to be in here? Something by Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. That would be great.
Well, individual Christians are free to choose for themselves what books they want in the Canon, but in doing so they shouldn't demand that the church at large alter their own system to accommodate them. Any group needs a set of rules or guidelines in order to function. To that end, attempts to change or significantly alter the rules should be put under careful consideration. And if they alter the purposes of the group and are not acceptable to the majority, they should be rejected. So if you happen to differ, you have two choices. Either live with the status quo or hit the road and start your own group. Anyway, we shouldn't take any choice concerning the Canon lightly, unless you would care to proclaim yourself to be more in with God than the church councils and the church at large. If you hold a contrary position, then you should develop more and better arguments than the church at large has. The factual aspect of this part has to do with the reception of the 27 books into the New Testament. The sum of the matter is rendered in two parts. 20 of the 27 books were accepted easily. The revered scholar Bruce Metzger, one of the foremost specialists on the Canon, tells us the following. In contrast, 7 of those 27 books had a more difficult time being accepted. That's because the Canon process wasn't just some random effort like throwing books onto a table. It was a dialectical process, one in which books were evaluated by several criteria. In some cases, it was more difficult than others to decide if a book met those criteria. The church as a whole wasn't just accepting books without careful consideration, but scrutinizing them carefully and only accepting or rejecting them with sufficient evidence. And what was that evidence? We'll now turn to a discussion of the criteria that were used to make selections for the Canon. As we've already said, the process wasn't one of those throw-it-on-the-table deals. But if that wasn't the way it was done, then what was? Our first point may be a bit of a surprise. The modern church places so much emphasis on the inspiration of Scripture that we may assume that it was a criterion for what was included in the Canon. But it wasn't. Inspiration was just one of many aspects of the life of the church, and one could regularly speak and write under inspiration. As the biblical scholar Lee MacDonald puts it, so, inspiration was not a criterion of canonicity, but a corollary of it. Something that was inspired could be canonical, but something not inspired could never be canonical. One criterion that was effective in the selection of the Canon was the rule of faith. This rule states that nothing will be accepted which is at variance with accepted scriptures or that teaches false doctrine. To be accepted into the Canon, the book must conform with the community's rule of faith. Under the same rubric, usage in the church appears to have been used as a way to establish historical precedent, and in turn, truth and relevance. As MacDonald puts it, now, critics may object that these are circular criteria, for they read it in these terms. The Canon endorses your doctrine and practices, and your practices and doctrines endorse your Canon. But that's not quite what's being done here. Rather, historic practice was being used as evidence to decide what was true and relevant. And as a parallel to our example of the American Canon, it would be like looking back to see in what way the Declaration of Independence was used by Americans and how much authority was given. Our third and final criterion is one we already alluded to in Part 1. A work must have been authored by an apostle or an immediate follower of an apostle in order to become part of the Canon. In Part 2 we noted our 7 fringe books which had a harder time getting into the Canon. The history behind these demonstrates the care which was taken to ensure that the criterion of apostolic authority was followed. These 7 books listed gained access to the Canon only after considerable debate over whether they could be attributed to the persons that bear their names. It would be correct to say of the New Testament as a whole that those who doubted apostolic authorship of a book also denied that book's canonicity. In our next section, we'll start discussing the history of the Canon and people who had a hand in its formation. And it may surprise you to hear what we think, that this guy had a lot to do with getting it started. Yep, that's right. Who was the first person to take a step to begin the New Testament? We don't have definite proof, but we have some pretty good indications that it was the Apostle Paul who planted the seed. The biblical scholar David Trobisch has made an excellent case for why Paul may have started the New Testament. In his work, Trobisch studied the compiling process of over 200 collections of letters, dated from 300 BC to 400 AD. He noted that a man of letters would collect and prepare his letters for publication. For example, the Roman orator Cicero, when collecting his letters, went over them personally, making corrections, polishing them up and getting rid of trivial material, and eliminating the names of deceased persons. He then selected which letters of his he wished to leave published. Trobisch suggests that Paul, as a man of letters, put together the books that make up his part of the New Testament canon as his own letter collection. After this process was completed and the man of letters died, someone would publish the letters. In Cicero's case, one of his former slaves did the job. In Paul's case, we can't be sure. The likeliest candidates would be Luke or Timothy. Based on this historical precedent, we have every reason to believe that the New Testament canon's initial core was a collection of Paul's letters, collected and selected by Paul himself and preserved by one of his followers. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? And a lot better than the standard critical idea that the churches found them in the attic somewhere and somehow threw them together by an unknown process. After what was likely Paul's contribution of his own letter collection to the Canon, what were the specific stages in the making of the Canon? There were two aspects to the next stage, one positive, one negative. Initially, what we find is that certain works were repeatedly called on by early church writers. Works we now find in the Canon were not yet canonized, but they were quoted or alluded to as authoritative works. In the group called the Apostolic Fathers, whose works are from the late 1st to early 2nd century, these works are all cited or alluded to. What about the other 6? Well, except for this one, all of the books are so short that it's possible that there was never any need to refer to them, especially in light of the fact that the total extant works of the Apostolic Fathers fits a volume about the same size of the New Testament. So it would have been very surprising if we had had quotes to all 27 New Testament books at this early date. In contrast, it should be noted that none of the non-canonical works of the New Testament are recognized or quoted as authoritative in this stage. We do have several quotations that were evidently preserved by means of oral tradition, but none that appear uniquely in the non-canonical works. Quotation and allusion reflected the positive development in the formation of the Canon. In contrast, a negative influence was that of heretics who tried to add their own works into the mix. Heretics motivated the church to identify, and eventually canonize, the true works of the apostles. Probably the most important of the heretics was this fellow, Marcion. Marcion's basic idea was that the God of the Old Testament was incompatible with the Jesus of the New Testament, and he sought to sever the connection between them. To this end, Marcion went through the Pauline epistles, choosing only some of them, and removing anything he didn't think was authentic. He also gutted the Gospel of Luke, accepting only about 3/4 of it as authentic. Now, some things should be noted here. First of all, it's obvious that a collection of Paul's epistles existed at the time for Marcion to pick apart. This would be in accord with what we said in our prior vid about Paul having a fixed letter collection. Second, Marcion appealed to the authority of the writings of the Apostle Paul. Even though he conformed the text to his own ideas, he clearly realized that only with apostolic authority could his ideas get anywhere. This shows that the criterion of apostolic authority was already established by his time. A third point is that Marcion was a very wealthy man, but in spite of this he obviously wasn't able to force his way into the Canon. The next time you hear the excuse that the Canon was decided based on power or money, you can say that if that were the case, we'd have Marcion's Canon today, not the one we have now. There was one last important stage to the creation of the New Testament Canon, which was the end result of the dialectical process of authoritative use on the one hand, and the redefining efforts of heretics on the other. That stage involved the making of lists which were meant to be officially recognized by the church at large. The first person to refer to something called the New Testament was this fellow, Origen. He lived from about 185 to 250 AD. Origen's New Testament collection consisted of the 4 Gospels, 13 letters of Paul, and Revelation. He also comments on several works that were on the fringe of acceptance as authoritative, in a way that shows they were being critically evaluated for authenticity. Of 2 Timothy, for example, he writes, "Some have dared to reject this epistle, but they were not able." Of Peter's epistles, he notes that one is acknowledged, and possibly a second, but this is disputed. To John he attributes 1 gospel and 1 epistle, and, as it may be, a second and third, but not all consider these to be genuine. Of James he implies some doubt as to its authenticity, but does accept the genuineness of Jude. He also mentions 2 books outside our current New Testament, the Shepherd of Hermas, which he calls divinely inspired, and the Preaching of Peter, which he rejects because it was not composed by Peter and was not inspired by the Spirit of God. What's important to note here is that Origen doesn't tell people to burn or get rid of the heretical Gospels, as some critics imply would be the case. Instead, he expresses admirable tolerance for them, even as he rejects their authenticity. That he doesn't viciously attack them indicates that the presence of false Gospels was an accepted fact, but one easily dealt with, not requiring any sort of political war to get rid of them, or the views they expressed. This would also suggest that the false Gospels were so poorly grounded in reality that they had to struggle to survive. And frankly, you only have to read some of them to get an idea why. Several close contemporaries of Origen wrote similar sentiments, although none use the formal term New Testament. To be sure, lists like the one made at Hippo and Carthage didn't end all possible controversy. Over church history, various persons or groups have argued for inclusion of some favored book or books, or the exclusion of others. We also have some denominations with what could be called a Deuterocanon, books that are considered of less value than the canonical books, but are still important. Even so, that core of 27 has, as a whole, remained stable throughout the broad sweep of Christendom. In the final analysis, it's the burden of critics to argue, on the basis of individual books, why the Church's criteria or selection is in error. And if you want to argue the point, you'll have to do a lot better than,
Hey, what about those songs by Elvis, huh?
See you next time.